Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, just a quick technical point. If you need translation, the whole debate will be in English. Bonsoir, juste un petit point technique. Si vous avez besoin... Simplement un petit point technique. Le débat sera tenu en anglais. Donc si vous avez besoin de traduction, veuillez lever la main et on vous apportera un casque. Merci.
Nous allons commencer dans 2 minutes puisque c'est à...
We are about to start in 2 minutes, since that's when the online streaming will start.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, we are very happy to present you tonight this second part of the ceremony, what we have called the late night talk show with the 10 members of the jury of the Martin Ennals Award for Human Rights Defenders in Geneva. It has already been mentioned several times today that it is the 30th anniversary of the Martin Ennals Award that has been delivered for the first time in 1994 to Harry Wu. Since then, the 10 members of the jury every year deliberate to choose the laureates that will receive the Martin Ennals Award. Every year, this is a process with a lot of candidates, few of them shortlisted, and few of them being finally awarded. This is not to say that all of them did not deserve a distinction, but this is the jury who decide every year who are the one that the most deserve the Martin Ennals Award for Human Rights Defender. This is the first time this year that we test this format of having the 10 jury members on the stage to answer the questions asked by one of the laureates of the Young Activist Summit this year. Cynthia Honyu-Hee comes from the Solomon Islands, and she is the president and the founder of the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, PISFCC. As a young human defender, she will be able certainly to ask everyone's most burning questions. I give her the floor, and I thank her for accepting to do this tonight for us. Thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you very much. 5 years ago, I was in a classroom with my classmates after we have had enough of seeing the realities of the climate crisis. My classmates and I decided, why not let's take climate change and human rights to the International Court of Justice to seek an advisory opinion for our people. So with my organization, we mobilized our respective governments, and we've joined by youths from around the world to mobilize their own governments as well. And so we were successful in mobilizing and creating a broad coalition that resulted in a resolution by the United Nations General Assembly on the 29th of March 2023. So now the case is before the ICJ, and the oral hearing will begin on the 2nd of December 2024, this year. So before I go into my question, I'm very honored to share this stage with, I'm intimidated as well by the richness of experience and brilliance on this stage. I've flew 24 hours, and I can see that it's very, at an hour that people are not here, but for what it's worth, a Solomon Islander is here, and she will listen to what you have to say, and you will add to her own personal journey. So I'm very honored to be here with you all. To begin with, the first question I would like to specifically ask to Guada and Silke. So my question is, coming from frontline communities, I've witnessed that climate change exacerbates inequalities and continues to drive rights violations. So my question is, how do your organizations navigate the intersection between climate change or environmental and human rights? Could you also share some examples of your action? Thank you. Guada, you can go ahead first.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm thankful to being here with you, Cynthia. Thank you very much. So maybe if I start, I know I only have 2 minutes, but number one, the right to a healthy environment, the right is already a right, which 30 years ago we didn't even think about. So it's good to know that 30 years later, you know, after the Martin Ennals, where we now understand that those people that are defending a right to a healthy environment, that are defending, you know, stopping the climate crisis, are human rights defenders. So that's the first thing. So we navigated by stating that people like Cynthia are human rights defenders. That's the first thing. And then we also navigated by making sure that people understand that human rights defenders are attacked because of who they are and because of what they do and because of what topics they, you know, fight against. And those defenders who are fighting at the moment against, you know, the climate crisis and for a better environment for all of us, they are the ones that are mainly attacked. So if you look at figures, you know, human rights, environmental human rights defenders, climate crisis defenders or fighters against the climate crisis are sort of the ones mostly attacked around the world. Killings are high against these environmental and human rights defenders, so we make sure that we highlight those aspects and fight against it. Thank you.
Thank you. Silke?
Thanks. I mean, I guess your story tells us the potential behind looking at those areas together and combining them. And I think when we do advocacy on climate change, we approach it from a justice perspective. My colleagues are just present in Baku at the International Climate Conference, trying to convince countries such as Germany, where I come from, but also other historical polluters to step up their financial support towards those countries that are most vulnerable and bear least responsibility for what we're seeing, but are most affected. So I think we also need to address it as an issue of global justice. And we've seen our governments, for example, signing new contracts for oil and gas exports from countries such as Egypt, Algeria, Colombia, etc., undermining basically the human rights cause, understanding that those industries actually drive human rights violations. So this is how we approach it in our advocacy work, to remind our governments of their obligations towards, you know, global justice issues and towards those countries.
Thank you, Silke. So I believe Guada touched on this and highlighted this, but Frontline Defenders publishes a global analysis annually, which highlighted what Guada highlighted just now. through the years that it's environmental rights activists and like myself and people who work in this space that are at most at risk among defenders. So my question is to jury member Alvaro. Could you tell us more about this risk and how best to support, activists and defenders like myself?
Of course, thanks. So I think when we talk about environmental human rights defenders, it's very important to clarify one thing. Environmental human rights defenders is an important label, it's a useful label, and it's great to see that increasingly they're being recognized. But it means a lot of different things. We are talking about the student activists, we are talking about indigenous human rights defenders, we are talking about land and water defenders. By grouping everyone under the name of environmental human rights defenders, we risk hiding racism, sexism, poverty. We risk hiding a lot of intersectional risks. And that's why at Frontline Defenders, we have started disaggregating our data and differentiating between indigenous human rights defenders, land and water human rights defenders. And the results are quite shocking. According to the Memorial Project, which is a coalition of civil society organizations coordinated by Frontline Defenders that documents killings of defenders, there were over 300 killings last year of human rights defenders. Of them, 31%, almost a third of them, were indigenous human rights defenders. It's important that we talk about this data. And why are they most a threat? It would take a whole panel and way more time than I have, but there's several aspects. They tend to be very grassroots. These are not people that necessarily plan to become human rights defenders. They felt the heat in their communities, quite often literally, and they had to do it. They are people who are in rural areas, in remote areas, and the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders is writing a report on this. So they have often no access to connections, no access to the cities, no access to diplomats. And they're often facing entrenched interest, massive corporations with unlimited funds, in collaboration with criminal armed groups, in collaboration with governments, that will not do anything to stop you and other environmental defenders. Thanks.
Thank you, Alvaro. I would like to also hear about the perspective of FIDH, if along those questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the first thing is just to remind ourselves, I've got 5 points to make in 2 minutes. The first thing is to remind ourselves about the global context within which we're discussing this. As the Deputy High Commissioner also alluded to this, inequalities are growing constantly, but we're also seeing economic actors, particularly multinational corporations, getting more and more power. Trade and investment flows and liberalization of that, as well as policies of international financial institutions, are also contributing to the violations of rights against human rights defenders, as well as those participating in protests. We also spoke about that earlier today. A core issue related to what was referred to earlier as the climate chaos, as opposed to the climate crisis, of course, really calls for us, when we're talking about even climate negotiations, to ensure that justice is really at the center of that. It also calls upon us to question the current growth-oriented and extractivist economic model, which has and is based on historical and systemic inequalities, as well as discrimination, and that was referred to in part by our colleague. We're seeing global majority countries, as well as communities living on the front line, actually experiencing the brunt of these emissions, and they're particularly vulnerable as well to debt. And their capacity to be able to respond to challenges is constantly under strain. And so I think the context is important while we're talking about human rights defenders, particularly within the environmental field. So the kind of risks which you've asked us to speak to, both FIDH and OMCT, I happen to be sitting next to OMCT, some years ago created a unique program which is called the Observatory for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders. And our focus really is on ensuring that voices of not only human rights defenders, but also organizations working to protect the rights of human rights defenders are also heard. And as a colleague has said, human rights defenders is really an all-embracing term, but we need to be aware of the different components of that term. The risks have been alluded to already, including arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances, as well as violations relating to freedom of association, freedom of expression, etc. Forms of how do we support them, right? The coordinated solidarity actions. Again, we heard that earlier this evening. The Deputy High Commissioner also spoke about the importance of solidarity. We've also got to ensure that even financial institutions and businesses are held to international human rights standards. We need to protect and the enforcement mechanisms which already exist, but also push for an improvement of those around the world. And climate justice is core to the protection of human rights defenders. As FIDH, we are committed to advocating for comprehensive and immediate climate action, which has justice as well as the fulfillment of human rights as its foundation, and prioritizing human rights as well as human rights dignity, even in negotiations relating to climate finance, and ensuring that the rights and livelihoods of global communities are not only protected, but are also strengthened. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to the next question, if that's possible. Environmental rights have bettered movements such as Fridays for Future, our movement as well, and this sort of movements are not traditional activism, if I should say. We could talk about a lot of movements around the world. They do not often have a structure or hierarchy. So I'd like to ask this question to Gerald from World OMCT. As an organization with a long history of reclaiming rights, what are sort of like the main tools you use to advance human rights? And do these synergies exist within this movement?
I think the first question is for us all to ask, what actually brings change? What is the theory of change? The OMCT is a World Organization Against Torture. It's a very pompous name, but we are a movement of some 200 organizations in places where torture is real. And who was one of the first members we had who was in a way also an initiator on the need to have a World Organization Against Torture? It was the mothers of the Maya de Playa in Argentina. This was not an organized human rights organization. This was not a hierarchical structure in any way. There was a need. There were people speaking out. There were people taking courage. And this is how change comes. We celebrate today, or this week, or something like this, the 40th anniversary of an anti-torture organization. And when I was in law school, it was all about the obligation of states, of ratifying, of implementing. Then you have UN mechanisms that are there to help this implementation. But if we really think what brings change, it's movements, it's the public, it's us. You wouldn't have a women's rights movement without properly helping by a convention against the violence against women that exists. And all these conventions are only there because you have social movements. They are not there because they're technocrats. There were people who asked for this. So I think we have to go away a bit. Of course, we have human rights organizations that protect human rights defenders like the one sitting here. We have organizations that know how to engage states on their legal obligations, etc. But in the end of the day, if you ask everybody here in the room, if you ask anybody here, if you ask myself, why am I doing work here on human rights? It's also because maybe I grew up, I saw things, I read things, I had movies, etc. This created the value base. Now, what we can do as organizations working on human rights, we can support these social movements. You had situations in Kenya, you had situations in Bangladesh over the last couple of months. Those were not human rights organizations that were at the forefront of this. It was students' movements. But we were essential in supporting them, in protecting them, in taking up their cases. And this is what you say, solidarity matters. And this is also true with the climate issue said before. In framing something of a right, we actually changed the narrative, we changed the discussion on this. We changed the discussion on the rights of disabilities by having a convention on disabilities. Now we talk about rights, not about benefits or social security, etc. And the same has to happen with social movements, the same has to happen on environmental rights. We have to talk about rights, and we have to frame it this way. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to hear the perspective of Horidox as well. Dana?
Thank you so much. And Cynthia, I just want to start by saying thank you for all the amazing work that you've done, and congratulations on all your impact and successes. And if there's anybody who's intimidated on this panel, it is me, because I think that kind of activism that you do is so, so important. So I just wanted to say that to start. And I'm afraid my answer to this question may be a little bit boring, but for us, the tool is information. The tool has always been information. HERODOX, which stands for Human Rights Information and Documentation Systems, was founded by Martin Ennals and Hans Thulin, both of which you've heard about today, on the notion that information, when well organized, shared, and secure, is the source of all change. And so the tools that we use to gather that information, to collect that information in today's age, to verify that information, to understand if that information was generated in some way, the tools always changed with the external context that we're in and the kind of movement that you're working in. So, there's such an ability to involve more people, get more information in different ways, and get it to the right places. And I think that that's really key in understanding not just then the external contact, but the groups that you're working with, understanding that information is also coming in so many different forms. I look back to my early days in human rights research and sitting with my note pen and pad, and now we're seeing information data coming from satellite data, from sensor data in environmental work, and so many different things. So from the perspective of HERODOX, I think that the main tool is always going to be information, and leveraging it and making sure that we are bringing the information to the right places from the right people.
Thank you. So Mr. Hans Thulin, the founder of Martin Ennals Foundation, often says that everyone can be a human rights defender, but not everyone wants to. And that's the challenge we also face in our line of work. We want to engage people, but it's not often easy when their interest is not violated or affected. So my question I'd like to put on the spot again, Guada. What does your organization do to encourage people to feel concerned and to commit to human rights values and actions?
Thank you. I'm going to first disagree a bit with Hans, if you don't mind. Everybody can be a human rights defender, but everybody wants to necessarily. Is that what you said? Because I think most people do want to. And I think humans, when we see an injustice, we want to do something about it, and that's why this is so valuable, and that's why we are capable of moving on. But just on the question, what does Amnesty do? Well, we're quite lucky at Amnesty in one way. We've got millions of members around the world, so they spread the word and bring people into our values. That's one way. But also through time, we've moved on, and we don't just use the written language. So we've used now podcast. We're doing all the social media aspects to bring people in and for them to understand what we're on about and why they have to be part of us. But I think because at the end of the day, and I think Gerald has mentioned it, and then Dana just now, it's us that make the change, not the law, not the UN or whatever. It's us that have to all get together and make the change. So the more people are with us, I think the more we're going to sort of make that change, because I think in Spanish we say, el pueblo unido jamás será vencido. So it is, if we're all in this together, we'll do it. So what we try and do is, for example, we have a call program on human rights education, reaching out to through education, what are rights, what is it that you can do, why is this important? And then new forms of informing, information, new forms of informing the public. This is, for example, one aspect. I heard just now, even though quite a lot of people left, that we're streaming this. So hopefully by streaming it, which is a new form, more people will be seeing it. So I encourage you all to, invite other people to see this and to come into within this community of defenders that we're all here to spread the word. Thank you.
Thank you. And Pooja, would you like to add to that as well?
Yeah. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Guada. I'm just going to complement what Guada said with also maybe a slightly different perspective also. My organization, the International Service for Human Rights, much like all the other organizations represented here in the jury, are also working to influence states and the individuals that represent states, that make up states, to encourage them to feel concerned and care about human rights as well, and to make decisions that are important and pertinent to the peoples and the communities that they represent. And we all do this really by ensuring that human rights defenders are centered in all of our campaigns and our calls. We support human rights defenders to be able to influence decisions at the international levels as well as at the national level in their own name. And we also work to reclaim harmful narratives against human rights defenders by highlighting the important work and contributions that they make towards justice, equality, and sustainable development. And I think we've heard today a lot about the incredible work of human rights defenders, the work that they do despite the great challenges that they face and the dangers that they face. But yet, states from all regions, including the states that claim themselves to be the biggest defenders of human rights, have failed us all in addressing some of the biggest human rights crises of our times. So in the years ahead, we do have to reckon with the triple planetary crisis, something that you're working on, occupation, apartheid, genocide, the erosion of the rule of law, and closing of civic space. And frankly, the only way, really, that states and people who support authoritarian ideologies and narratives will really feel concerned about human rights is if there is a political cost to violating human rights. The impunity that we witness at the highest levels weakens not only the collective values that we all share for equality and dignity, but also weakens the very institutions that fail to deliver on their mandate of ensuring a just and equitable world order.
Thank you, Pooja. Do you want to add? Okay, let's move on. I would like to hear from another jury member as well. In terms of digital technology, it has changed advocacy recently as well. And so, can you give us examples of how digital technology has facilitate your work as a human rights organization from, this is for Lucy, from a Human Rights Watch perspective?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Cynthia, and lovely to meet you. Congratulations also, I wanted to say, on your work. I have followed it from afar, and I remember when your organisation started the case at the ICJ, so, really exciting changes in the human rights and climate space. So I'm from Human Rights Watch. I'm based here in Geneva. I was asked a question about digital technologies, and I admit I don't do digital investigations myself. I had to ask my colleagues, what is this work that we do on digital technologies? Because it's fair to say, certainly at my organisation, sort of the emergence of digital technologies has really changed a lot of the way that we do our human rights investigations. So we've set up what we call a digital investigations lab, and they employ open source research, geospatial analysis, I had to find out what that was, data analysis, 3D modelling, spatio-temporal research, and so on. We still, of course, do the sort of old-fashioned, if you like, interviewing witnesses and gathering testimonies. That's very much still the core of our work, but this is a new part that's really, I think, added to our work, particularly in those countries where we don't have access to, the places that we need to go to interview victims and survivors, either because we're not allowed in or because it's too dangerous there. So this has given us kind of like a whole new toolkit. So just a little bit about kind of the methodology. This team, they first of all gather information, mostly information that's posted on social media. They spend a lot of time properly documenting and preserving that information because we know that often it appears on social media and then is later deleted. Also, then they spend time verifying that it's authentic, the information that we're gathering, because we know that there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation out there on social media. We do things like use geolocation or chronolocation, which might involve, for example, looking at the shadows in a video to try and work out what time of day it was. I was fascinated by this when I was talking to my colleagues, so I learned a lot. things like looking for landmarks in videos and then matching them with the maps we have of the areas, talking to experts who speak local languages or who might be military experts, and they can tell you about the uniforms that are worn by soldiers that we're looking at in a video, these sorts of things. And then the final stage is kind of the analysis, looking for trends, looking for patterns in the violations that we're seeing, who are in the video, what videos, what sort of people are we seeing? Are they civilians? Are they combatants? And these sorts of things to try and then make a legal determination as to whether there's been a violation of international law. So that's broadly what we do. I just wanted to give you 2 examples where we've used this a lot. And the first is North Korea. So we work on North Korea quite a lot. You may know it's a very repressive country. Not a lot of information comes out of North Korea about the human rights situation there. So, and when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, the government really closed in further, kind of locked up the country even more, as many countries did. But this really impacted the information that was coming out. So to do analysis about what was happening there, the Digital Investigations Lab looked at geospatial analysis using satellite imagery along the border with China to see how the government had added new fencing and double fencing sometimes, added new sort of security infrastructure along the border to really cut off so that people could no longer escape, and even trade could no longer come in across the border. So that's just one example. Another one was on Saudi Arabia. So we used digital technology tools there to investigate and expose evidence of killings of hundreds, perhaps thousands even, of Ethiopian migrants who were crossing the border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. This is a very common migration route, and we'd heard rumours that there were killings happening there. We, of course, couldn't access the area to go and investigate ourselves. So we looked on social media, found videos on TikTok, actually, and then worked out, sort of did the geolocation to work out where the videos were taken and so on. We also analysed hundreds of photographs that we found on social media, and you know, to build a picture of what was happening there. And we found, as I said, that there were thousands of migrants being killed by Saudi border guards and shot at close range, attacked with explosive weapons, really shocking stuff. And this was something that was happening, but it was not in the media. It wasn't being talked about, it wasn't being known about. So, you know, these new techniques really helped us to document that, expose it. We published a report on it. It got a lot of attention in the media. And just to finish the story, you know, we heard subsequently that there was the number of killings either completely stopped or was reduced. Sadly, though, that was a year ago, I suppose. Sadly, we've heard that the killings have started again. So it's not a good end to the story, but I think it's a useful illustration of how we're using these techniques these days in human rights investigation.
Thank you, Lucy. You spoke about information, Dana. Would you like to add on to that of how Heterodox have used digital technology?
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you so much for that around like the work of Human Rights Watch and sort of the use of different data sets to prove human rights violations in another way is really incredible. And I think a lot of the examples that you raised also kind of go to my point about digital technologies and using new digital tools, is that it doesn't actually matter what the tool is as long as you have a strong critical tech literacy. I think, you know, in our human rights defenders community, we've seen a lot of, you know, the rise of digital security, which is obviously so important for people. But what we also saw was people learned how to use one tool, used one encryption tool, and then when another encryption tool came along, we were back to sort of square one. And so I think whether you're looking at encryption, whether you're looking at learning some of these new technologies to collect information and to process information, a huge challenge for the human rights community is really figuring out how do we teach critical tech literacy? How do we learn critical tech literacy from younger generations, which I know I am always doing, and how do we make sure that we're sort of pushing that forward and not being tool specific? At Herodox, we build our own open source software called Uwazi, which is a database software. And I think this is also really important to support the open source tech community. We need to have alternatives to some of the big tech companies that are having complete monopolies over our information and data. And supporting open source software is, I think, going to be increasingly important, as will be creating sort of independent, critical tech infrastructure. So server bases that are not owned by some of the big tech giants, ways to communicate, decentralized web potentially. There's so many different tools that we can think about using. But again, it goes back to we just need to use the right tool for the right thing and not get sort of swept up in what's shiny at the moment. And it becomes an interesting strategic question for most civil society organizations. And then I think the last thing I would say, well, I guess there's two more quick points. One is, we should rightfully be worried about the onslaught of new technologies and the potential risks that they face, but we should also embrace some of them for our use. I often find myself using the term fight apples with apples, and I really think it's really important. If our adversaries are going to use new technologies to repress, then we should use new technologies to fight back as well. My last point on this is, and I think this is something that I particularly love about our organization, Herodox, is that it's not just about the technology. It's actually, we have a technology wing that creates this incredible open source software, but we also have a whole team of human rights experts, and their expertise is in documenting human rights violations. So when we work with partners to bring them a new database, it's not just about the database, it's about how they're organizing information, how it fits with their theory of change, and what kind of data structure they use. So I think also just not getting swept up in necessarily the digital tools, but recognizing that there always has to be a human involved and human first.
Thank you, Dana. You've sort of highlighted the next part of the question as well. On one side, you have digital technology advancing our work, but on the other side, you have digital technology used to harass human rights defenders. And so this brings me to the next jury that I'd like to ask this question to, Santiago. Can you tell us what practices are used to harass human rights defenders and to curtail human rights? 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. As I'm also not an expert on digital technology, and I didn't have any colleague to ask questions. So ironically, I asked ChatGPT, what do we have to say? And the answer was very good, by the way, I have to say. And so I checked what are the threats that we have right now because of digital technology. And there's not much differences than 30 years ago. Let me give you some of the examples. Phone tapping. In the past, when I was 20, 30 years ago, the telephones were tapped. My telephone at the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights was tapped by the Colombian government. Today we have Pegasus. So that's basically exactly the same. There's no difference with that. Surveillance of correspondence. In the past, governments will take the letters in the mail, and with the support most of the time of the post office, which they control. Today we have something called PRISM, which was made public by Snowden, and it basically does the same with our mail. So basically it gets into our computer and gets all the emails we received. Tracking movements. In the past, they will have 10, 15 people, and as you see in the movies, going after someone. And right now, they have GPS and they have geolocation. They can just know exactly where you are because you're using the phone. But it's exactly the same. Identification of individuals. They used to use photo IDs. Now they have face recognition, which is probably one of the main threats we all have. Spreading disinformation. The radios, the newspapers controlled by the governments used to do the same, and they still do in many places. And right now we have the fake news and the bots spreading false information. Harassment and intimidation is exactly the same as in the past. Now they do it online. And data collection and profiling is even more than before now precisely because of artificial intelligence. So the threats haven't changed. They are the same, but they are a lot more efficient, and they are massive. And if there is one thing that I would recommend, because they were asking, first we need to regulate. I mean, that's critical, and we need to regulate to ensure that there is transparency, and we should regulate not only for government, but also for the private sector. I think that's critical. And finally, what I would say, what's our main challenge, on my view at least, it's in one word, it's called algorithm. The person in charge for building the algorithm for Google, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, just any social media you can mention, is probably much more powerful than all the presidents of the world together. They are controlling the information. And we have no control on what are in those algorithms. So a critical thing for regulation is to have transparency of what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to hear from human rights first perspective as well. So Brian, and if you could also provide some recommendation.
Thank you very much, Cynthia, and congratulations also on your work. Actually, I was going to say much of what Santiago said and preface it by saying it's time to hear some old man perspective here. Because surveillance part of surveilling human rights defenders didn't begin with the internet, right? Santiago's given some examples there. Also, people's houses and cars were bugged. And transnational surveillance didn't begin with the internet. I hang around a lot. I used to hang around a lot with anti-apartheid activists in London in the 1980s, and they were followed physically, their houses were bugged, their phones were tapped, their mail was opened. And so I also think it's not an either or, right, where surveillance didn't begin with the internet, and it didn't change either to go completely from offline to completely online. What we see in many parts of the world are people who are under surveillance are under both kinds, as in digital surveillance, but then also offline surveillance. And yes, I'm not underestimating at all the scale and the new efficiency of all this new razzle-pop digitization. But in terms of the basics of why people are being surveyed, and they often lead also to offline attacks, to physical attacks, right? The first UN conference on human rights was in Tehran in 1968, and part of the discussion was there around new technology and how new technology would not replace the old instruments of repression, but would complement them. And I think that's what's happened. The old mindset of the authoritarian regimes has stayed much the same. They've got new digital tools, but I think for us to push back against those, really, we should go back to first principles about how to evade surveillance online and offline, because I often think it's a bit of both. In that spirit, in response to what some activists in Hong Kong had asked my organization in 2019, 2020, we produced some pretty simple guides which we just posted on the internet in various languages in how to delete your digital history, how to thwart digital detection. We upgraded those a couple of years later in 21 for Afghanistan, again, just posted on the internet in local languages so people could see them without having to download anything. Also with some tips on how to avoid biometric detection. So I'm all for countering digital surveillance, but I just want to remind everybody that the digital part of it is only half. There's plenty of other offline surveillance that still happens. And sometimes that culminates in physical attacks and, as we know, murders. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. The conversation is very interesting, but we're pressed for time as well. We're reaching the end of 2024, which has been dubbed as the election year. As half of the world's population, some 3.7 billion people has the opportunity to go to polls in 72 countries. We already know that results of some of these elections will have clear consequences on human rights. Brian, does this mean a decline of progressive ideas, or is this a crisis of governance?
You're asking me because I'm from an American organization, right? That's fine. Look, I think, we're all having a horrible reality check. I do think it's certainly a decline in the popularity of progressive ideas, and we need to accept that. I think there are various other things we need to accept and own. There is no handbrake on Trump. He controls the White House, the Supreme Court, and both houses of Congress. There's no silver lining here. It's going to be extremely tough. And I don't present this either as a consolation or as a silver lining, but what I see from American civil society is a change from 2016. I think there is a greater acceptance of how terrible things are likely to be. I think American civil society, and I'm overgeneralizing here, but much of it in 2016 and then in 2017 when Trump became president was really paralyzed and sort of in denial. And you saw these hashtags which used to drive me nuts of, not my president, or this is not who we are. Well, he is your president, and it looks like that's actually who you are. And so there's less pushback against that now, less a denial of reality, more of an acceptance of this is going to get really tough. And what I hope, I'm beginning to see some glimmers of this, is American civil society, which has generally been pretty reluctant to join much of the rest of international civil society, now realizing it's got a lot to learn from the rest of the world. So I don't think that's any great silver lining. I wish it wasn't like that. But I think one of the outcomes of a terrible election is that American activists may start looking outside of America for greater solidarity and to learn more things. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. And Santiago, would you like to add to that question as well?
Yeah, I think that during 5 decades, starting in the 1940s, the end of the 40s, 1948 to be very specific, we had the most progress in the history of humankind, and with principles and values that we all work for. That came to an end, probably the 90s. We always refer to the 90s as the golden age of human rights. It probably came to an end in 2001, I would say September 11, but it could be other reasons as well. And since then we are going back. At the beginning was not going back, we were just staying without advancing too much. But now we are going back, and very likelihood we are going to go starting in January 2025, unfortunately. The threat is going to be a lot bigger than we had until now. And the problem is they do not share the same principles and values that we all share. They are against the multilateral systems, and they are against the multilateral system because those multilateral systems, namely the UN, but all the other ones as well, they do share those values and principles, which they are against. So they are going to attack the UN, they are going to attack all the multilateral organizations, and we are not prepared for that. I mean, that's one of the concerns. I've been talking to many people. We are not ready for that. And we need to figure out how to confront the upcoming reality, which is not good at all. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Santiago. The struggle of Zolia, an Afghan woman and one of the laureates of the Martin Ennals Award this year, we've seen today, shows us that rights of women are never assured. On the contrary, change in power dynamics seems to dictate whether women are forced to wear the veil or are forbidden to wear one, whether women can access abortion, or whether their sexual and reproductive health and rights are respected. So my question is to Alice from FIDH. Can you explain to us what is happening? How does your organization foster better respect for women's rights? And what can people do in their everyday life to fight against, those regressive policies?
Thank you very much. I think quite simply what's happening is we're seeing a struggle against misogyny and patriarchy, including what was spoken about earlier today or this evening, gender apartheid, which is just another form of what we've mentioned. And so what is needed? Elimination of discrimination, as well as guaranteeing of equal rights between men and women and the other in both law and in practice. Our key strategy as FIDH has been really to advocate for the ratification without reservation of international and regional women's rights protection instruments, as well as their implementation. Your other question was how to foster better respect for women's rights, both in theory as well as in practice, in terms of lived experience. Well, firstly, we've been doing a lot of work lobbying for the withdrawal of reservations, and we're happy to see that through work with other organizations in quite a few countries, we've seen a withdrawal of reservations in Jordan, Morocco, and Tunisia, and this has created an opening for reform of national discriminatory laws. We've also focused on campaigns for women's rights, but contextual, and we've seen a lot of that happening on the continent of Africa. Documentation of women's experiences of violation is also particularly important, but also promoting access to justice, both in words as well as in deeds. And we've done this in 3 different ways. We're documenting what are obstacles to accessing justice, not only at the national level, but also at regional, international level, and therefore calling for legal as well as political reforms. Examples of recent challenges in Russia, for example, this year has been declared the Year of the Family. And on the 12th of November this year, the State Duma, which is the lower house of the Russian parliament, approved a bill which is to ban what is called propaganda in favor of a child-free lifestyle. And of course, we heard about Afghanistan. In March 2024, the government announced that women may be stoned to death as punishment for adultery. So those are some of the challenges which we're seeing women facing. The second broad area which we're using is providing legal support as well as representation to victims and survivors of sexual and gender-based crimes. But we're also calling upon the International Criminal Court to ensure that it systematically includes sexual and gender-based crimes as part of its prosecution strategies. And finally, sexual and reproductive rights is also a key area in which we're involved, documenting violations and also advocating for the adoption of reforms which will really improve the lives of women to be able to live with dignity. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to also hear from the OMCT perspective. So, Gerald, would you like to answer that as well?
Yeah, maybe 3 things. The first one, I touch on what Santiago has spoken about, how the world is changing. And I think the first thing is that we often look at issues in silos. You know, there's the US backlash, there's the Russian on the former Soviet Union, this backlash on gender, or an environment or reproductive rights, but they're all connected. It's the same forces that go against the discussion on climate and environment. It's the same forces that go on land and environmental rights. And it's the same forces that go on LGBTIQ. It's the same forces that push back on gender. So I think what we see at the moment is in this sort of new world with a multipolar world where gender is suddenly chosen, which I had always seen as the area we made the most progress in some way. I mentioned the CEDAW Convention and how the women's rights movement has developed. We see now the backlash attacking the gender movement. And I think we can all respond to a little niche, but if we don't see this as something together and responding on those challenges together, we will not be successful. I think clearly in the work we do, there's a lot of things we can do. I think it starts, I love this US thing on no taxation without representation. It's precisely this. We can all start by making sure that our organizations are representative of minorities, about different groups, diverse, and certainly about gender equality in our composition. We should not go to panels that are only male, for example. Those are all things we can do in our everyday life. More precisely, as an OMCT, as a World Organization Against Torture, I'm from Germany originally. I grew up with 2 prejudices. I looked at human rights, how I was taught it. I didn't really see economic, social, cultural rights initially the same way as I see it today. I might have looked at discussions in law school where there was a discussion whether violence against women is a human rights violation because it might be committed in the private sphere. But the net reality is if you put yourself into the reality of people that suffer, it's very clearly a human rights issue. And at the OMCT, we have been very early on working on the idea that violence against women is not only violence against women, it actually constitutes torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And it changes from a private matter, which states like to put it in, into a state responsibility, that they have a responsibility to protect. So within the anti-torture movement, whatever we do on anti-torture, when we go to some of the UN bodies, we always try to bring women rights movements into this. And we also want to make sure that gender-based violence is understood as torture, cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment. And finally, an issue that all unites us on this podium, we all work to protect human rights offenders. We know that women human rights offenders are among those that are targeted, and they have sometimes different needs than male human rights offenders. We have a laureate here from Afghanistan. She has a family with her. If she has to relocate, that the family comes with her, that states like Switzerland give a visa not only to her, but as part of the human rights offenders protection policy also to her kids and family, is self-evident if we want to be true about protecting human rights offenders. So there's a lot of work to do for us to come together on the causes, to recognize gender-based violence for what it is, but also to recognize the special needs that women human rights offenders have.
Thank you, Gerald. When Martin Griffiths stepped down from his position as UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator earlier this year, he said he sees the current funding deficit for humanitarian aid as a failure of values and commitments, citing gross disparity between the amount of money spent on war and the amount of money spent on humanitarian aid. This question is for Lucy from Human Rights Watch. Do you think the same could be said about the funding of human rights initiatives? And if so, could you tell us more about this funding crisis?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think I would describe the funding crisis in human rights as perhaps even more severe than what we see in the humanitarian space. And both are very much competing for increasing spending in security and defence areas. And I think this trend is going to be precipitated with the new government the new president in the US. He's made very clear his disdain for human rights, and also for the UN. So I think we can expect to see a withdrawal of a lot of the money that the US has traditionally put into human rights and UN spaces, and including for NGOs. I mean, you may know that the US is a very significant part of the funding that goes into the system on human rights. And just say, I think it is multifaceted. NGOs will also be hit hard, right? I think what we expect to see is probably philanthropic funders as well in the human rights space, turning away from funding international sort of human rights issues and looking very much domestically because they're concerned about what's going to be happening domestically in the United States and the need to respond to those that human rights crisis. So I think human rights NGOs are also really suffering in the funding crisis. But turning to the UN human rights system, I think the current High Commissioner Volker Turk has been very vocal about the underfunding of the human rights pillar of the UN. So it's very much sort of the poor cousin of the three pillars of the UN. I think the Human Rights Office receives only 4% of the total UN budget, which is really shocking, and particularly when what we're seeing, of course, is an increase in human rights crises around the world. So the Human Rights Office has put out appeals. On top of this, we're also having what we call the liquidity crisis. And what this means is that UN member states are not paying their dues that they need to pay to be part of the UN. This is mostly the big funders of the UN, so it's the US and China, but to be honest, the last I checked, China had actually paid. So it's mostly the fact that the US has not been paying their dues. And this is hitting many parts of the human rights system really hard. So, for example, we work often with special rapporteurs on human rights that are appointed by the Human Rights Council. They used to do 2 country visits a year, now they only can do 1. We see the human rights treaty bodies having to cancel sessions. And then there's the investigations that the Human Rights Council sets up to respond to human rights crises, like you might have heard of the fact-finding mission on Sudan, or the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, or the Commission of Inquiry on Palestine. All of these are bodies that have been hit very hard by this liquidity crisis and don't have the sufficient staff to carry out the mandates that they've been given by the Human Rights Council. And finally, just wanted to add that, you know, the crisis is not only states neglecting to put money into to funding human rights issues, but also active obstruction as well. And I just wanted to highlight the process. So when the Human Rights Council establishes new mechanisms to address a human rights crisis, a budget is developed, and then it goes to New York for approval. And when it gets to New York, there are committees there that discuss the funding, and traditionally we see countries like Russia, China, Cuba actively undermining these budgets and fighting to reduce the budgets of these bodies. And so having the impact that these bodies can't effectively carry out their mandate. So I think the outlook is pretty grim, to be honest, on human rights, and particularly, you know, following on from what you said about the US elections, I do think that's going to have an impact on the UN system and particularly on the human rights funding. Thanks.
Thank you. I would like to hear as well the perspective from Silke, and if you could also speak on possible avenues for fundings.
I'm not sure I can offer magic fundraising strategies here, I'm afraid.
We all come to you.
I know, I'd rather echo Lucy's concerns about the dark times ahead of us in terms of support and funding for human rights work. Not only by looking at what's happening in the US, we've also seen in Europe, right-wing governments emerging, cutting funding. The Scandinavians have been historical donors of supporters of human rights works, and I've recently spoken to a colleague from Sweden who told me that the Swedish government doesn't fund human rights advocacy in Sweden anymore, and human rights work abroad only if it can clearly be shown that it suits national interests. So I think here we have a huge task to convince our governments, or to prove our governments that you cannot actually play off national security against human rights. You cannot play off national interests against international or strengthening a national democracy against strengthening international accountability. Supporting human rights is about, yes, supporting fundamental values. It's about international obligations, but it is also a question of national security, I would say. We have seen in Russia what can happen if you repress systematically critical voices up to a point where there's no resistance anymore against a brutal war. So this happens when you stop funding, supporting human rights, or when you undermine human rights by giving priority to many other considerations in your foreign policies. Keep migrants away, geopolitical criteria, economic criteria, undermining human rights causes. This is what you end up with, and we cannot be interested in an increasingly authoritarian world. How are we going to solve our global problems like climate change? So do I have the answer about how we convince our governments and how we also convince our societies, how we generate more international solidarity, generate empathy, convince people to become human rights defenders? You said everybody can be a human rights defender if you see the injustices. Let's all try to convince our societies. That's all I can say. And I think by seeing the remarkable work of those whom we are honoring today and spreading the news, this is what we can do. Maybe this is the fundraising strategy we should all be following.
Thank you, Silke. I have one last question. So thank you very much for being patient. So far, it's directed to Pooja and Alvaro. A coalition of 18 international and regional human rights organizations released the Declaration Plus 25 in April this year. This landmark document complements the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders from 1998 and takes into account the regional and international jurisprudential developments of the last 25 years. So my question to you both is, can you tell us more about the process and why this document is so essential? Pooja, do you want to go first?
Thank you, Cynthia. It would be my pleasure to talk about the Declaration plus 25. So as a reminder, I'm sure everybody already knows that last year we marked the 25th anniversary of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. This is a declaration that recognized the importance and the legitimacy of the right to defend human rights. And over the last 25 years, these fundamental rules and principles have guided national, regional, and international efforts to support and safeguard those who advocate for human rights. Notwithstanding the Declaration's impact, its full potential remains unrealized due to insufficient implementation and enforcement by states. In addition, since the Declaration's adoption 25 years ago, international law on the recognition and protection of the right to defend human rights has evolved, and new challenges have also emerged. And among these, we've talked about some of them already this evening, includes digital threats, stigmatization, criminalization, etc. And the Declaration sometimes has not sufficiently discussed these issues, or they are absent because maybe they were not as prevalent 25 years ago as now. And so a group of organizations came together with a view that it was important to take stock of these developments in the normative frameworks related to the protection of human rights defenders since 1988, and to kind of articulate them into a document. And so we embarked on this process, and the process is really important because unlike 25 years ago, where the Declaration was really a state-led process, where governments kind of negotiated this, and in a very different context and environment where civil society access and participation into negotiations was not quite as it is today. We felt that this process should really be civil society-led. It should really put human rights defenders, human rights experts, legal experts at the center of developing this authoritative document. In addition, we also spent a year engaging in consultations with over 700 human rights defenders from all regions, working on diverse issues with diverse identities to provide inputs through in-person consultations or online questionnaires in order to really get a sense of what are the experiences of human rights defenders today. This document then was adopted in April in Bangkok after a 2-day experts meeting in which actually Martin Ennals laureate Aziz was among the experts who was present. Maybe I hand over to Alvaro to talk about the relevance and significance of the Declaration plus 25.
Thanks for the question. I'll try not to repeat too much from what Pooja has said. I believe that ISHR and frontline defenders are quite of the same approach to this declaration. So in the last 25 or 26 years, of course, the thinking around protection of human rights defenders has evolved immensely, which is a good thing. Our understanding of what a human rights defender is has expanded. The risks have certainly evolved and expanded as well, I would say. So it was time to say it quickly. So there's 2 points that I would like to make in this response. The first one is that I think Pooja has explained why it was important to do it now and why it was important to do it the way it was done. But the original declaration is not bad. The text is not bad. That was never the problem. The problem was the implementation. So this declaration, the Declaration plus 25, really tried to be, first of all, a reminder that this is still something very much pending to do. And then a reinvigoration, a renewed push to implement the declaration as well, and really thinking what that means in today's world. And the second point is that the declaration and the Declaration plus 25, They are both important texts. But human rights defenders would still exist if there were not these declarations. They existed before, and they will exist afterwards. The same way that human rights existed before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's something that colleagues have addressed already. The legitimacy of human rights defenders do not come from papers or from international treatises. So in a way, these declarations are our attempt to catch up to reality, in that sense. I mean, I'm sorry, I fear I'm the last speaker, so I'm sorry to end with like a bad note. But on the 25 years that have happened, 26 years that have happened since the declaration, there has been at least over 4,000 documented killings of human rights defenders, which just tells us that there's so much to do. And I'm afraid that we will be here in 25 years discussing the declaration plus 50, and many of the pending issues will still be unresolved. Thanks.
Thank you, Alvaro. I think we've run out of time as well. I do apologize for taking up all of your time. Thank you to the jury members for answering all the questions. There's a lot to talk about, and I've learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience have as well. The discussion has shown how important it is to continue, as though Alvaro ended on a sad note. It shows the importance of continuing this work to promote and protect human rights defenders and this civil society space so that we can continue to advance the values that binds humanity together. So without saying anything else, I'd like to thank all of you for your time and the jury members for the generous answers and being generous with your wisdom as well. And to your audience for being generous with your time. It's very late. This is really a late night talk show. So I'll end with that. Thank you so much, everyone.